The community center doors swung open with more force than necessary. Vincent Ashford walked in like he owned the place, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Everything about him screamed expensive, from his perfectly tailored navy suit to the Swiss watch on his wrist that probably cost more than most people's cars. He didn't want to be here. That much was obvious from the way his lips pressed into a thin line as he surveyed the modest music hall. The paint on the walls was chipped in places, and the fluorescent lights hummed with that annoying buzz that cheap fixtures always made. This was supposed to be his day off, but his old college roommate had practically begged him to judge the local arts festival. Some favor for the community, he'd said. Vincent had agreed, mostly because saying no would have taken more energy than just showing up for a few hours. A woman near the registration table recognized him and gasped. "Oh my goodness, you're Vincent Ashford. I saw you perform at the Kennedy Center last year." Vincent offered a practiced smile, the kind that looked warm but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you. Always nice to meet an admirer." He signed the guest book with a flourish and accepted his judge's badge, barely glancing at the volunteer who handed it to him. The morning dragged on. He sat through a high school jazz band that couldn't quite keep tempo, a middle-aged man butchering a clarinet solo, and a string quartet that made him wince at least a dozen times. During each performance, Vincent made elaborate notes on his scoring sheet, his pen moving with sharp, critical strokes. He wasn't being mean, he told himself. He was being honest. These people needed to know where they stood if they ever wanted to improve. Around noon, the festival organizers called for a lunch break. Vincent immediately headed for the one area of the community center that interested him, the back room where they kept a beautiful Steinway grand piano. It was the only quality instrument in the entire building, probably donated by some wealthy patron who'd taken pity on the place. He'd just settled onto the bench and started running through a Chopin etude when he noticed someone else in the room. A woman sat on a folding chair near the wall, so quiet he'd almost missed her completely. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a simple flower print dress that had clearly been washed 100 times. Her shoes were those basic canvas sneakers you could buy at any discount store, a little scuffed at the toes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her hands rested in her lap. Working hands, Vincent noticed, with short nails and what looked like old calluses on the fingertips. She wasn't staring at her phone like most people would be. She was actually listening to him play, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. Vincent finished the piece with a dramatic flourish. The woman opened her eyes and applauded softly. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "Chopin's Etude in E major, right? One of my favorites." He was mildly surprised she'd recognized it. "You know your classical music." "A little bit," she said modestly. "Are you one of the judges?" "I am." Vincent stood and stretched his fingers. "Vincent Ashford. I perform professionally. Concert halls mostly. I've done Carnegie Hall 3 times. That's wonderful." There wasn't a trace of sarcasm in her voice, just honest appreciation. "I'm Elena. My daughter's in the children's choir. They perform later this afternoon." "Ah." Vincent nodded, his interest already fading. "A choir mom." He glanced at his watch. "Still 40 minutes until the next session. Do you play?" Elena hesitated for just a moment. "I play at my church. Nothing fancy. Just hymns for Sunday service and some simple pieces for the children's programs." Vincent made an effort not to smile condescendingly, but he wasn't entirely successful. Church pianist. That explained everything. The worn dress, the humble demeanor, the calloused fingers from what was probably a day job doing manual work. He felt a sudden surge of generosity, the kind that came from being in a good position and wanting to share wisdom with those less fortunate. "You know, you picked a good time to watch," he said, settling back onto the bench. "I'm actually warming up for a piece I'll be performing at the Lincoln Center next month. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Very technical. Perhaps you could learn something." "I'd love to hear it," Elena said simply, settling back in her chair. Vincent launched into the piece with all the showmanship he could muster. His fingers flew across the keys, hitting every note with precision. He added extra flair to the dramatic sections, really making the piano sing. This was what separated the professionals from the amateurs, not just playing the notes, but commanding them, bending them to your will. When he finished, he looked over at Elena, expecting to see awe on her face. She was smiling, but it was a different kind of smile than he'd anticipated. Not starstruck, almost knowing, but that didn't make sense. "You're very talented," she said. "That's a challenging piece." "It is," Vincent agreed. "Takes years of training to master something like this." "Where did you study? Did you take lessons as a child?" "I did," Elena said. "A long time ago." Before Vincent could probe further, a group of other festival participants burst into the room, laughing and chatting about lunch plans. The moment dissolved into the general chaos of people coming and going. Elena stood up, smoothing her dress. "I should check on my daughter." "Thank you for playing. It's been a long time since I heard live classical music." "Well, if you stick around after the children's choir, I'm sure there will be more performances," Vincent said. "Probably not at my level, but you might enjoy them." Elena's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure I will. Have a good afternoon, Vincent." She walked out and Vincent turned back to the piano, already forgetting about the church pianist in the flowered dress. He had 6 more hours of judging ahead of him, and then he could finally escape this place and get back to his real life, the one with recording studios and concert halls and audiences who actually understood what they were listening to. He didn't notice the festival organizer watching, Elena leave with a small secretive smile. He didn't hear the whispered conversation between 2 volunteers near the door. Did she sign up for the open showcase? Yes, she finally agreed to play. This should be interesting. Vincent just kept playing, filling the room with complex runs and dramatic chords, completely unaware that the quiet woman in the simple dress had just set something in motion that would change everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, and about himself. The afternoon sessions would be starting soon, and somewhere in the building, Elena was helping her daughter adjust her choir uniform. Her calloused fingers gentle as they fixed a crooked collar, those same fingers that hadn't touched a concert grand piano in over a decade, fingers that still remembered everything. The afternoon session was going about as well as Vincent expected. Which is to say, not well at all. A teenage boy had just finished murdering a perfectly good Mozart sonata, and Vincent had to resist the urge to actually cover his ears. He marked his scoring sheet with brutal honesty and tried not to let his frustration show on his face. The festival organizer, a cheerful woman named Patricia who wore too much perfume and smiled way too much, bounded onto the small stage. "All right, everyone, we have something special planned. We're opening up the floor for our community showcase. This is where anyone who signed up in advance gets a chance to share their talent with us." Vincent suppressed a groan. "More amateur hour." He glanced at his watch. Just 2 more hours and he could leave. "Our first performer," Patricia continued, checking her clipboard, "is someone very special to our community. She's been teaching music to our children for free every Tuesday evening, and she makes Sunday services at St. Mary's something truly beautiful. Please welcome Elena Rodriguez." Vincent's head snapped up. Elena, the church pianist? He watched as the same woman from earlier walked onto the stage, still wearing that simple flowered dress and canvas sneakers. She moved quietly, without any of the theatrical flair most performers used. She just walked to the piano bench and sat down, adjusting it slightly. Vincent leaned back in his judge's seat, trying to get comfortable. This should be quick at least. She'd probably play some basic hymn arrangement. He'd give her a decent score for effort and they could move on. But then Elena did something that made Vincent sit up straighter. She looked directly at him, her expression calm and gentle, and said, "I'd like to dedicate this performance to all the musicians here today, every one of you, professional or beginner, who keeps music alive in our world." Something in her voice made Vincent uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. There was a quality to it, a quiet confidence that didn't match what he expected from a small-town church pianist. Before Elena could begin, Vincent felt that familiar surge of generosity again. The same feeling from earlier, when he'd wanted to educate her about real music. He stood up, interrupting the moment. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying across the small hall. "Patricia, might I make a suggestion?" Patricia looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Vincent. You're our guest judge." Vincent walked toward the stage, aware that everyone's eyes were on him. "I was thinking, since we're doing a community showcase, perhaps we could make this more educational, more interactive." He smiled at Elena, that same condescending smile from before. "What if we did a little demonstration? Elena plays first, Then I follow up with the same piece, showing some of the techniques a professional uses. That way everyone learns something. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. One older man in the back actually shook his head, but Vincent didn't notice. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "That's an interesting idea," she said quietly. "Excellent." Vincent was warming to his own plan now. "How about this? I'll even let you choose something a bit challenging. Have you ever tried Beethoven? Perhaps his Moonlight Sonata? The first movement is quite manageable for intermediate players." "I know the piece," Elena said. "Perfect. Give it your best shot and then I'll demonstrate how to bring out the emotional depth. The key is in the dynamics and pedal work, you see. Most amateur pianists miss that nuance." Vincent was fully in teaching mode now, barely noticing the looks being exchanged around the room. Patricia cleared her throat. "Vincent, maybe we should just let Elena—" No, it's fine," Elena interrupted gently. "I appreciate Vincent's enthusiasm. But if we're going to do this, would you mind if I chose a different piece? I had something else prepared." Of course," Vincent said magnanimously. "What did you have in mind? Something from the hymnal?" He actually chuckled at his own joke. "Rachmaninoff," Elena said simply. "His prelude in C-sharp minor." Vincent's smile froze. That wasn't a beginner piece. That wasn't even an intermediate piece. That was a piece that professional concert pianists respected for its technical demands and emotional intensity. Surely she didn't mean— "You're familiar with it?" he asked, his voice a bit less certain now. "Quite familiar," Elena said. Vincent felt a small flutter of doubt but pushed it away. Maybe she'd heard a recording once and didn't realize how difficult it actually was. Maybe she'd tried to learn it and managed the first page. He'd heard plenty of amateur pianists attempt pieces way above their skill level. It never ended well. "Well then," he said, trying to keep his voice encouraging. "That's ambitious. Go ahead. I'll be interested to see how far you get." Elena didn't respond. She simply turned to the piano, took a breath, and placed her hands on the keys. The room grew quiet. Someone in the back coughed. Vincent folded his arms across his chest, preparing himself to watch kindly while she struggled through it. He was already planning his own performance in his head, thinking about how he'd rescue the piece after she butchered it. Then Elena began to play. The first chords thundered through the community center with such power that Vincent actually flinched. These weren't the tentative, careful notes of an amateur. This was command. This was authority. Her hands moved across the keys with devastating precision, pulling out the dark, brooding intensity that made Rachmaninoff's prelude famous. Vincent's arms slowly unfolded. His mouth fell open slightly. The piece was nicknamed The Bells of Moscow for the way it mimicked the deep, resonant sound of cathedral bells. Elena made the piano sing like an entire bell tower, each chord perfectly weighted, each run absolutely clean. Her fingers, those calloused fingers he'd dismissed as the hands of someone who did manual labor, danced across the keys with the kind of technical mastery that took years of serious training to develop. But it wasn't just the technique. Vincent had heard plenty of technically perfect performances that left him cold. This was different. Elena played like someone who understood loss, who'd lived through darkness and come out the other side. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. The middle section of the piece came softer and more delicate, and Elena's touch became impossibly gentle. The same fingers that had just shaken the walls with powerful chords now coaxed out notes so tender they made Vincent's chest tighten. He watched her face. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't performing. She was living inside the music. Around the room, Vincent saw things he rarely witnessed at professional concerts anymore. An elderly woman in the front row had tears streaming down her face. A young man stood frozen halfway through, taking off his jacket. The teenage boy who'd played earlier sat with his mouth hanging open. Even Patricia had stopped smiling, her perpetual smile, and just stood there, transfixed. Vincent looked down at his hands, the same hands he was so proud of. The hands that had played in concert halls around the world. They were trembling slightly. A cold feeling was spreading through his stomach, a feeling he recognized but hadn't experienced in years. Fear. He'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a church pianist who dabbled in music. This was something else entirely. This was someone who could play circles around half the performers he knew on the professional circuit. The way she handled the complex passages, the musical maturity in her interpretation, the absolute confidence in every single note. This was conservatory-level playing. This was world class, and he'd just publicly challenged her to a duel, treating her like a student who needed education. Elena moved into the climactic final section of the piece. The music built and built, the bells tolling louder and darker, until finally resolving in those haunting final chords that seemed to hang in the air long after the sound had faded. She lifted her hands from the keys and opened her eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was absolute. Then the room erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding so hard their hands must have hurt. Someone actually shouted, "Brava!" The elderly woman was openly crying now, and she wasn't the only one. Vincent remained in his seat, unable to move, unable to think. His carefully prepared list piece felt hollow in his mind now, like empty showmanship compared to what he'd just witnessed. Elena stood and gave a simple bow, nothing elaborate, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then she looked directly at Vincent, and in her eyes he saw something that made him feel even worse. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. She just looked kind, maybe even a little sad. Patricia rushed to the microphone, her voice shaking with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think there's something you should know about Elena." Vincent's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He had a terrible feeling he was about to learn exactly how badly he'd messed up. And he was right. Patricia's voice cracked slightly as she spoke into the microphone. "Many of you know Elena as our church pianist and the lovely woman who teaches your children music for free every Tuesday evening. But some of you might not know her full story." Vincent felt like he was watching a car crash in slow motion. He couldn't look away, even though every instinct told him he didn't want to hear what came next. 17 years ago, Patricia continued, Elena Rodriguez was accepted into Juilliard on a full scholarship. She was only 16 years old at the time. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Vincent felt his face drain of color. Juilliard, the most prestigious music conservatory in the country, the place where legends were made. By the time she was 21, Patricia went on, she was performing with symphony orchestras across Europe. Music critics in New York called her the most promising interpreter of romantic composers in a generation. She had recording contracts lined up, concert tours planned for years in advance. The New York Times wrote a full-feature article about her. Elena stood near the piano, her hands clasped in front of her. Looking uncomfortable with the attention, she tried to catch Patricia's eye, probably to ask her to stop. But Patricia was on a roll now. She was being compared to Martha Argerich and Yu Wang. At 23, she performed Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. That's one of the most difficult pieces in the entire piano repertoire for those who don't know. The recording from that performance still gets played on classical radio stations today. Vincent wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Every condescending word he'd spoken to Elena replayed in his mind like a horrible echo. Do you play? You could learn something. Give it your best shot. He'd treated a Juilliard graduate who'd performed with major orchestras like she was a beginner who needed his guidance. So what happened? Someone in the audience called out, "Why is she here and not still performing?" Patricia's expression softened. She looked at Elena, who gave a small nod. Permission to continue. 15 years ago, Elena married her college sweetheart, Thomas. He was a teacher, loved kids, wanted a big family. They had their first child, a daughter. Patricia paused, her voice getting quieter. 6 months after their daughter was born, Thomas was diagnosed with ALS. The room went completely silent. Even the people who'd been whispering stopped. For those who don't know, ALS is a terrible disease. It slowly takes away your ability to move, to speak, eventually to breathe. There's no cure. Thomas was only 27 years old when they found out. Elena's eyes were fixed on the floor now. Her hands, still clasped in front of her, were trembling slightly. Elena had a choice to make, Patricia said. She had a world tour scheduled. Recording contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Magazine covers. Everything a young musician dreams of. But Thomas needed full-time care. The medical bills were overwhelming. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Vincent felt sick. He knew where this was going. So Elena walked away from all of it. She canceled the tour, broke the contracts, gave up the career she'd spent her entire life building. She came back here to her hometown where Thomas's family could help with the baby. She took a job as a receptionist at the medical center, working double shifts to pay for Thomas's care. At night, after working all day and taking care of her husband and baby, she'd practice on whatever piano she could find. Sometimes the one at the hospital chapel, sometimes the old upright at her mother's house. Someone in the audience was crying now. Actually, several people were. They had 2 more children, Patricia continued. Thomas lived for 8 years after his diagnosis, much longer than the doctors expected. Elena said it was because he was fighting to spend more time with his kids. During those 8 years, Elena never performed publicly once. She never complained. She never asked for help. She just did what needed to be done. Vincent looked at Elena again. She was crying silently now, tears running down her cheeks, but she was smiling too. A sad, beautiful smile that somehow made everything worse. Thomas passed away 2 years ago, Patricia said softly. By then, Elena's name had been forgotten by the classical music world. She'd been away too long. The recording contracts had gone to other pianists. The concert halls had moved on. Her moment had passed. The teenage boy who'd played earlier stood up suddenly. "That's not fair," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's incredible. She should be famous. She should be playing at Carnegie Hall, not stuck here in some community center." Patricia smiled gently at him. Elena doesn't see it that way. After Thomas died, people told her she should try to restart her career. She could have. She's only 42. Many pianists perform well into their 70s. But do you know what she chose to do instead? The boy shook his head, wiping his eyes. She started teaching music for free to any child whose family couldn't afford lessons. She plays at St. Mary's Church every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening. She volunteers at the hospital, playing for patients who are scared or lonely or dying. She performs at nursing homes for elderly folks who never get visitors. Last year alone, she gave over 300 free performances and taught 46 children who otherwise would never have had access to music education. Vincent put his head in his hands. He'd judged this woman. He'd looked at her worn dress and scuffed shoes and decided he knew everything about her. He'd offered to teach her like she was some amateur who needed his expertise. The only piano Elena has regular access to, Patricia added, is the old upright at St. Mary's. The one with the broken middle C that doesn't always play right. That beautiful Steinway in our back room? She'd never played it before today. This was her first time sitting at a quality concert grand in over a decade. The room exploded again, but this time it wasn't just applause. People were standing, some openly weeping, others shaking their heads in amazement. The elderly woman in the front row had to be helped to her feet by the person next to her. She looked at Elena with such admiration and love that it hurt to watch. Elena finally stepped forward and spoke, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Please," she said. "Please, everyone. It's okay. I'm okay, really." The room gradually quieted down. "I want you all to know something," Elena continued, her voice stronger now. "I don't regret my choices. Not for a second. Yes, I gave up my career. Yes, I walked away from everything I'd worked for, but I got 8 more years with the man I loved. I got to be there when each of my children took their first steps, said their first words. I got to hold Thomas's hand when he died, knowing he wasn't alone, knowing our kids were taken care of. That's worth more than any concert hall or recording contract could ever be." She looked directly at Vincent then, and he felt like she could see straight through him. "Music isn't about fame or recognition or proving you're better than someone else," she said. "It's about connection. It's about bringing beauty into a world that desperately needs it. When I play at church, I see people who work 3 jobs to feed their families. I see single mothers who are exhausted and scared. I see elderly folks who've lost their spouses and don't know how to keep going. And for those 3 or 4 minutes while I'm playing, they get to forget their troubles. They get to feel something beautiful." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. That's what music is supposed to do. And honestly, I feel more successful now than I ever did when I was performing for critics and reviewers who were just looking for mistakes. Vincent couldn't take it anymore. He stood up abruptly and walked toward the stage. Everyone watched him, probably expecting him to say something, but he couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. Instead, he stopped in front of Elena and did something he almost never did. He bowed. A deep, respectful bow that performers reserve for their teachers and the masters they admire most. When he straightened up, Elena was looking at him with that same kind expression, no judgment, no anger. Just understanding. Thank you for the performance, Vincent managed to say, his voice hoarse. It was... I've never heard that piece played with such he couldn't finish. What word could possibly capture what he'd just witnessed? Elena reached out and touched his arm briefly. You play beautifully too, Vincent. I've heard your recordings. You have a gift. Those words coming from her after everything he'd said and done nearly broke him. The moment was interrupted by the sound of children's voices down the hall. The choir was gathering for their performance. Elena glanced toward the door. I need to go check on my daughter. She gets nervous before performing. She walked off the stage just like that, returning to being a regular mom, making sure her kid was okay. Like she hadn't just changed everyone's understanding of what it meant to be a true musician. Vincent stood frozen on the stage long after Elena had left. The audience was slowly filing out, heading toward the auditorium where the children's choir would perform. He could hear their excited whispers, snippets of conversation about what they just witnessed. I had no idea. Can you imagine giving up everything like that? That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Patricia approached him gently. Vincent, are you all right? You look a bit pale. He managed a weak nod. I need some air. He walked outside to the community center's small garden area, a patch of grass with a few benches and some overgrown flower beds that nobody had time to maintain properly. The autumn air was cool against his face. He sat down heavily on one of the benches and stared at his hands. These hands had played for presidents, for royalty, for sold-out audiences in some of the finest concert halls in the world. He'd spent 30 years perfecting his technique, building his career, making a name for himself. And in 15 minutes, a woman in a flowered dress had made him question everything he thought he knew about music, about himself. The sound of the children's choir drifted through the open windows. They were singing something simple, probably a folk song, but their young voices were sweet and pure. Vincent closed his eyes and listened. When was the last time he'd really listened to music without analyzing it, without picking apart the technique or judging the performance? He couldn't remember. They're not bad, are they? Vincent's eyes snapped open. Elena was standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool breeze. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I saw you come out here and thought maybe, well, I wanted to check if you were okay. If I'm okay? Vincent let out a bitter laugh. You just humiliated me in front of 100 people, and you're asking if I'm okay? Elena's face fell. She moved to leave. I'm sorry. That wasn't my intention at all. I should go. No, wait. Vincent stood quickly, holding up a hand. I'm sorry. That was unfair. You didn't humiliate me. I humiliated myself. You just played piano. Everything else was my own doing. Elena studied him for a moment, then slowly sat down on the bench. After a brief hesitation, Vincent sat down too, leaving a respectful distance between them. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the children sing. I recognized you immediately, you know, Elena said finally. When you walked in this morning. I have your recording of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. I've listened to it probably 50 times. It's extraordinary. Vincent felt heat rise to his face. Then why didn't you say anything? Because it didn't seem important. She shrugged slightly. You were here to judge a community festival. I was here with my daughter. We were just two people in the same building. The fact that you're famous and I used to be... It didn't matter. Used to be, Vincent repeated. Patricia said you could restart your career if you wanted to. You're still young enough. Why don't you? Elena was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, they could hear the choir finishing their song to enthusiastic applause. Do you know what the hardest part of Thomas's illness was? She asked, not looking at Vincent. It wasn't the physical care, though that was exhausting. It wasn't even watching him deteriorate, as horrible as that was. It was the guilt. Guilt? Every single day, a tiny voice in the back of my mind would whisper, you gave up everything for this. You could have been famous. You could have been playing for thousands of people. Instead, you're here, changing bedpans and crushing pills and working double shifts at a medical center. That voice told me I'd made a terrible mistake. Vincent didn't know what to say. But then, Elena continued, her voice softer now, Thomas would smile at me. Or one of my kids would crawl into my lap with a book. Or I'd play a simple song at church and see someone in the congregation close their eyes with this expression of pure peace on their face. And I'd realize that voice was lying to me. I hadn't made a mistake. I'd made a choice. And it was the right one. She turned to look at Vincent directly. When I was performing professionally, you know what I thought about on stage? Reviews, critics, whether my technique was perfect enough, whether the audience was impressed, whether my career was advancing or stalling. I was so worried about being good enough that I forgot why I fell in love with music in the first place. And why did you? Vincent asked. Fall in love with it? Elena smiled, a real genuine smile that transformed her whole face. My grandmother. She lived with us when I was little. She couldn't read or write, came to this country with nothing, worked as a housekeeper her whole life, but she could sing like an angel. She'd sing while cooking, while cleaning, while tucking me in at night, and I'd watch people stop and listen to her. I'd see their faces change. She brought joy into people's lives just by sharing this gift she had. She paused, watching a bird hop across the grass. That's what I wanted to do, bring joy. Somewhere along the way, when I got accepted to Juilliard and started performing professionally, I lost sight of that. It became about achievement instead of connection, and I was good at the achievement part, really good. But I wasn't happy. And you're happy now? Vincent asked, unable to keep the skepticism out of his voice. Playing an out-of-tune piano in a small church? Teaching kids who'll probably never become professional musicians? You're happy? Yes, Elena said simply. I really am. Last week, one of my students, a little girl named Ruby, finally managed to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with both hands together. She's been working on it for 3 months. When she got it right, she looked up at me with this huge smile and said, I did it. I'm a real piano player now. And Vincent, I swear, I felt more proud and fulfilled in that moment than I did after any concert I ever performed. Vincent shook his head. I don't understand. You had everything. You were at the top. And you just walked away. No, Elena corrected gently. I didn't walk away from music. I walked away from the music industry. There's a difference. The industry is about competition and recognition and proving yourself. Music itself is about something else entirely. What? Elena thought for a moment. It's about being human. Really, fully human. It's about expressing things we don't have words for. About connecting with people in a way that goes deeper than language. When I play at the hospital, I see patients who are scared and in pain. I can't cure them. I can't take away their fear, but I can give them 4 minutes where they feel something other than suffering. That's not nothing. That's everything. The children's choir had finished. People were starting to leave the building, calling goodbyes to each other, kids running ahead of their parents toward the parking lot. Elena's daughter appeared in the doorway, spotted her mother, and waved enthusiastically. I have to go, Elena said, standing up. But Vincent, can I tell you something? He nodded, not trusting his voice. You're an incredible pianist, truly gifted. But when you were playing this morning showing off that Liszt piece, you know what I noticed? You weren't enjoying it. You were performing it flawlessly, hitting every note perfectly, but there was no joy in it. It looked like work. Like something you had to prove rather than something you wanted to share. She bent down slightly to look him in the eye. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Vincent. You're already enough. The question is, when you play, who are you playing for? Are you playing for the critics in your head? For your reputation? Or are you playing for the person in the last row who saved up money to buy a ticket because they needed to hear something beautiful? Elena's daughter called out, Mom! Can we get ice cream on the way home? In a minute, sweetie. Elena called back. She looked at Vincent one more time. I hope you figure it out. Because the world needs musicians who remember why music matters. She started to walk away, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Vincent, if you ever want to remember what that feels like, you're welcome to come by St. Mary's any Tuesday evening. I could always use help with the kids. Some of them are getting pretty advanced. They'd be thrilled to learn from someone who's played at Carnegie Hall. She said it without any irony or sarcasm, just a genuine invitation. Then she was gone, walking toward her daughter, the two of them heading to the parking lot hand in hand. Vincent watched them go. Elena's daughter was chattering excitedly about the performance. And Elena was listening with complete attention, like nothing in the world mattered more than what her child was saying. Vincent sat back down on the bench. The community center was nearly empty now. Soon he could leave, go back to his hotel, fly home tomorrow, return to his carefully constructed life of concerts and recordings and reviews. But Elena's words echoed in his mind. Who are you playing for? He pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. Next Tuesday evening at 6 p.m., he had a meeting with his manager about an upcoming tour. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he opened a new note and typed, St. Mary's Church, Tuesday evenings. Teaching. He didn't save it or add it to his calendar. Not yet. But he didn't delete it either. He just sat there in the garden, listening to the sound of car doors closing and engines starting, watching the autumn leaves drift across the grass, and wondering when exactly he'd forgotten that music was supposed to make him feel something. 3 weeks passed before Vincent did anything with that note in his phone. 3 weeks of concerts and rehearsals in the same routine he'd followed for decades, but something had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about Elena, about the way she'd played that Rachmaninoff prelude, about the things she'd said in that garden. Most of all, he couldn't stop thinking about her question. Who are you playing for? He'd performed at 2 major venues in those 3 weeks. Both times he'd played flawlessly. Both times he'd received standing ovations. Both times, as he'd bowed and smiled and accepted the applause, he'd felt nothing, just emptiness. Like he was going through motions he'd repeated so many times they'd lost all meaning. On a Tuesday afternoon, Vincent found himself driving. He told himself he was just going for a drive to clear his head. He didn't admit where he was going until he pulled into the parking lot of St. Mary's Church. It was an old building, probably built in the 1960s, with faded brick and a wooden cross above the door that needed repainting. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. The kind of place Vincent would normally drive past without a second glance. He sat in his car for 10 minutes arguing with himself. This was ridiculous. He was Vincent Ashford. He didn't volunteer at community music programs. He had a reputation to maintain, a career to protect. What if someone saw him here? What if word got out that he was teaching amateur students in some rundown church? But then he remembered Elena's face when she'd played, the pure joy in it, and he got out of the car. Inside, he followed the sound of piano music down a hallway. The church smelled like old wood and candle wax. His expensive shoes squeaked on the linoleum floor. Through an open door, he could see a small room with an ancient upright piano that looked like it had survived a war. Several children sat in folding chairs ranging from about 6 years old to maybe 13. Elena sat at the piano, showing a young boy how to position his hands for scales. She looked up when Vincent appeared in the doorway, and for a moment surprise flashed across her face. Then she smiled. "Everyone," she said to the children, "we have a very special visitor today. This is Vincent Ashford. He's a professional concert pianist who's played in some of the most famous concert halls in the world." The kids looked at him with varying degrees of interest. The youngest girl was more focused on a loose thread on her shirt. The teenage boy in the back looked skeptical, like he didn't believe this fancy-looking stranger could teach him anything useful. "Hi," Vincent said awkwardly. He'd performed for audiences of thousands, but somehow 6 kids in a church basement made him nervous. "Vincent, this is Ruby, David, Claire, Antonio, Lily, and that's Jake in the back." Elena pointed to each child as she said their names. "We're working on scales today. The exciting stuff." She said it with gentle humor, and a few of the kids giggled. "Would you like to stay?" Elena asked. "We could use another pair of hands. Ruby's been working really hard on her C major scale, and I think she's almost ready to show someone." The little girl Elena had mentioned in the garden, Ruby, perked up immediately. "Really? Can I show him?" "If he'd like to hear it," Elena said, looking at Vincent. Vincent found himself nodding. "I'd love to." Ruby scrambled up to the piano bench, her feet barely reaching the pedals. She positioned her hands carefully, glanced at Elena for reassurance, then started playing. The scale was slow and careful, each note deliberate. She made it about halfway through before hitting a wrong note. She froze. "It's okay," Elena said gently. "Try again. Remember, thumbs under on F." Ruby nodded seriously and started over. This time she made it all the way through, finishing with a flourish that was entirely her own addition. She looked up at Vincent with enormous pride. Vincent felt something crack inside his chest. This little girl, playing a simple C major scale on an out-of-tune piano in a church basement, looked happier than he'd felt in years. That was perfect, he said, and meant it. Ruby beamed. The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Vincent worked with Jake on hand independence, helped Claire understand time signatures, and listened patiently, while Antonio played through a simplified version of Für Elise 3 times in a row. It was messy and imperfect and nothing like the polished performances he was used to, and it was wonderful. When the lesson ended and the kids' parents started arriving to pick them up, Vincent felt genuinely disappointed that it was over. Ruby's mother thanked him profusely, explaining that her daughter had been begging for piano lessons for 2 years, but they couldn't afford them. "Elena's been a godsend," she said. "Ruby practices every single day on the keyboard we got her for her birthday." After the last student left, Vincent and Elena sat in the empty room. The evening sun came through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. "So," Elena said, "what did you think?" Vincent leaned back in his chair. "I think I haven't enjoyed music that much in 20 years, Elena smiled. "They're great kids. Antonio's got real talent. Give him a few years of serious training and he could be something special. His family can't afford lessons. Single mom, 2 jobs. She can barely afford rent." Elena shrugged. "That's why I started doing this. There are so many kids who have talent and passion but no opportunity. Someone gave me that opportunity when I was young. This is how I pay it forward." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever miss it? The performing, the recognition, the career?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. I'd be lying if I said I never wondered what might have been. But Vincent, here's what I've learned. There are different kinds of success. The world tells us that success means fame, money, recognition, being at the top. But what if success is actually about impact? About making people's lives better, even in small ways?" She gestured around the shabby room. "These kids will probably never become professional musicians. Most of them will grow up, get regular jobs, have families, but they'll always have music. When life gets hard, when they're stressed or sad or overwhelmed, they'll be able to sit down at a piano and find comfort. Some of them will teach their own children someday. Ruby's already talking about teaching her little brother." Elena stood and walked to the window. "I used to think music was about being the best, about proving I was talented enough, skilled enough, special enough. Now I know it's about being generous, about sharing something beautiful with people who need it." Vincent joined her at the window. Outside, kids were playing in the church parking lot while their parents chatted. Ruby was showing her mother how to do the scale she'd learned, counting out loud and moving her fingers in the air. "I've been thinking about something you said," Vincent admitted, "about who I'm playing for. And I realized I couldn't answer that question. I've spent so long building my career that I forgot there was supposed to be a reason behind it all. And now I think maybe I need to remember." He pulled out his phone and showed her the note he'd saved. "Would you mind if I came back next Tuesday?" Elena's smile was radiant. "We'd love to have you. Fair warning though, the piano's terrible. The kids are loud and nobody here is going to care that you've played at Carnegie Hall." "Good," Vincent said. "That sounds perfect." Over the next 6 months, Tuesday evenings became Vincent's favorite part of the week. He still performed concerts, still maintained his professional career, but something fundamental had changed. When he played now, he thought about Ruby's joy over mastering a simple scale. He thought about Antonio's determination to get through Für Elise without mistakes. He thought about Elena, who'd given up everything and somehow ended up with more than she'd lost. His manager noticed the difference. "I don't know what's happened," she said after a particularly moving performance. "But whatever it is, keep doing it. That was the best I've heard you play in years." Vincent knew what had happened. He'd stopped trying to prove himself and started trying to connect. He'd stopped performing for critics and started performing for people. He'd remembered that music wasn't a competition or a career. It was a gift. One Tuesday evening, after all the students had left, Elena was locking up the church. Vincent helped her fold up the chairs and put away the music books. "You know," Elena said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "That day at the festival when you challenged me to that piano duel." Part of me was annoyed, but mostly I was sad. Vincent winced. "I'm still sorry about that. I know. But let me finish." Elena picked up her bag. "I was sad because I recognized something in you that used to be in me. This desperate need to be better than everyone else, to prove your worth through your skill. And I knew how lonely that was." She looked at him directly. "But you're different now. I see it when you work with the kids. You're not performing for them. You're giving to them. You've learned what it took me years to figure out." "What's that?" "That the best musicians aren't the ones with the most impressive technique or the most prestigious awards. The best musicians are the ones who remember that music is about love. Love for the art, love for the people you're sharing it with, Love for the simple act of making something beautiful in a world that desperately needs beauty. Elena headed toward the door, then paused. Same time next week? Wouldn't miss it, Vincent said. After she left, Vincent sat down at the terrible upright piano with the broken middle C. He played that same Rachmaninoff prelude Elena had performed months ago. It wasn't perfect. The piano was too out of tune for that, but he played it with more feeling than he'd played anything in years. He played it for Ruby and Antonio and Claire and all the other kids who were learning that music could be a refuge and a joy. He played it for Elena, who'd taught him more in a few months than he'd learned in decades of professional training. He played it for his younger self, who'd fallen in love with piano long before he'd started worrying about critics and reviews. Most of all, he played it for himself. Not the self who needed to be the best, but the self who simply needed to create something beautiful and share it with the world. When he finished, the church was quiet. No applause, no audience, no reviews. Just silence and satisfaction and the deep sense of peace that comes from finally understanding what you're meant to do. Vincent stood up from the piano, turned off the lights, and headed home. Next Tuesday couldn't come soon enough.